Hey everybody, welcome to another edition of American Rambler. I'm your host, Colin Woodward. Thank you for listening to the podcast. On today's show is part 2 of my talk with historian Emory Thomas. You might know him from his biographies of Robert E. Lee and Jeb Stuart, and he has also authored the book The Confederate Nation. So he was one of the cornerstones of the University of Georgia history department for a long time, back when Bill McFeely was there. But they produced a lot of great scholarship, and Emory was nice enough to talk with me for quite a while. Hopefully you have listened to part 1, which talks about his undergraduate years at UVA and playing football and how he ended up in Athens, Georgia. He has Georgia roots, which he talked about. But here in part 2, we go deeper into his books, ask him about why he wanted to write about Robert E. Lee and Jeb Stuart. And we also talk about some more recent things, such as the Civil War sesquicentennial, which I don't know how much of an impact that made, generally speaking, but some good things did come out of it, and he talks about one. And I've actually been working on an essay. I don't know where it will get published, if ever, but looking back at the Civil War at 160, and more specifically the Civil War since the sesquicentennial, because I think a lot of things have happened in terms of commemoration, and no one really cares very much about 160th anniversaries. But I think in comparison to what was going on at the 150th, I think we have a lot to talk about in terms of the Civil War and race relations and monuments and everything that I've been talking about for years here on the podcast, but also do day in and day out as a historian. So part 2 of my talk with Emory Thomas is coming up. What's been going on? Well, I finally went to a concert, my first post-COVID concert, and it was to see the Drive-By Truckers, who I've seen a number of times, a few times in Richmond, a couple times in Little Rock, and they always put on a good show. I don't think they really rehearse very much before they go out on tour. I think, they do a sound check and then they just hit it. But they always produce a pretty high energy show. It was outdoors, so that was good, despite the fact that a lot of people are vaccinated. You never know who is and who isn't. And I'm guessing there were probably a lot of people at the show who were not. So I was a little nervous about that, so I did wear my mask throughout the show. If you saw me there, I was one of the few people wearing a mask. So that wasn't great, even though the truckers asked everybody to wear a mask indoors through the whole show, including going to the bathroom. Their roadies had masks on, but you can't sing a song with a mask on, so obviously the truckers were not masked. And Patterson actually spits on the stage sometimes, which is pretty gross. I knew he had done that. I guess I never noticed he did that before the previous show. So I wasn't too close. I didn't want to get too close because that's where most of the people are. And I did not want to be in the mosh pit, so to speak, during the show. I was cool hanging back, wearing my mask. And I guess that went well in terms of health concerns. But a friend of mine that I went with, who's a big Truckers fan, he was a little worried yesterday he maybe had COVID, so he got tested, came back negative, which was great, but I did go with him, so I was a little nervous yesterday, even though the fact that I have been vaccinated and have been wearing my mask mostly outdoors. I should say I've mostly been wearing it when I go out and go somewhere indoors, like the grocery store or Lowe's or whatever it may be. I am wearing it indoors. I know a lot of people are not. So still trying to be careful there. The numbers are really bad. And, you hear all the stories at night about the hospitals filled up and which states are bad, including Texas and Florida especially. So there hasn't been a lot of great news lately. But I'm trying to get through another election here in Virginia. It is for governor. And honestly, I'm really sick of politics. Really sick of everything being politicized and waking up to angry people on Twitter for whatever it is. It's, I don't know. I go back and forth sometimes about quitting Twitter. I've had some really bad experiences on there. I guess as everyone has at times on Twitter if you do post, but I don't know. I just can't take any more of this anger and this politicization of everything. And it doesn't matter if you're on the right. I don't ever really hear from right-wing people on Twitter, but just people being so angry about politics all the time is just really a drag. So it was nice to see the Truckers to get kind of a release. And they are a political band, but they were not political the other night. They did play Surrender Under Protest off of American Band, but mostly it was the older stuff. They didn't play a whole lot of their newer stuff. And by that, I mean, even going back to The Big To Do, I think they played Birthday Boy off of that. They did play Surrender Under Protest, but nothing off the last few albums. They did not do Perilous Night, which I was hoping they would do. They didn't do Armageddon off of The Unraveling. So they just, I guess it was Southern comfort food, you could say. They did a lot of old stuff going back to Southern rock opera. They actually did The Day of Graduation, which I've never seen them do live. That was pretty cool. But you never know what you're going to see because they don't have a set list. They certainly don't do the same concert every time. They do mix it up, but they kind of started out with the rock stuff and then settled into a few slower ones in the middle and then kind of kicked it up a few notches toward the end and ended with Let There Be Rock, which is a great one. So no complaints about the show other than it ended right at 11 on the dot. So I don't even think they played for 2 hours. Usually they might go 2.5. But the opener started at 8 and the Truckers stopped at 11. So it was 3 hours on the dot for the whole thing. And with the opening act going for about 45 minutes, the Truckers show was shorter than what they usually do, but it was a solid hour 45 or so. So certainly got my money's worth, $25 to see them. It's a great deal. They are one of the best rock bands out there. I don't know enough about music to say, who's better or whatever, but they're certainly my favorite band that is touring right now. So that was fun and no COVID. So the first outing was a success. The next one is me going to see the Red Sox and the Orioles at the end of September. I'm going to be cautious for that, but that will be outdoors, and I don't think I should have any problems there. And hopefully the Red Sox will win. They have been beating up on the Orioles. They're not playing so great against the good teams like the Rays and the Yankees and Houston earlier in the year, though they haven't played them in a while, thank God. But they got some good teams coming up. They have to play the Mariners, who are trying to get a wild card spot, so that's not going to be a piece of cake necessarily with them playing in Seattle. But they're pretty well positioned to make the playoffs, and if they do, I think we can consider the season a success. I don't think they're going to go that far in the playoffs, not to be pessimistic, but I don't think they have a good enough team to beat these other teams. But considering the not so great year they had last year, this has been a good season, but they do have some work to do in the off season. Last year, I almost don't even count it as a season because it was so short due to COVID. But I think they do have a lot of talent, and if Sale is healthy and they can maybe pick up another good starter, I think they'll be really good next year. They were doing great till the All-Star game, and have not been playing so great since. But there have been a lot of highlights even when they haven't been playing well. So if they can just kind of put it all together, it'd be a really good team. But there have been problems with COVID and just, dumb errors and base running mistakes and things like that. They definitely have some work to do. And I don't know if Cora will be back next year, but I think if everyone stays around, next year might be a really good season, but we'll see. All right, here it is, part 2 of my talk with Emory Thomas. Well, I want to skip ahead a little bit because you talked about some of your books and the Confederate Nation. Seems like that. I mean, did that kind of put you on the map in terms of Civil War studies?
Well, I hope so.
Yeah.
Ironically, I knew that Frank had the contract to do the New American Nation series book on the Confederacy. I don't know, he got into a writing, not a shouting match, but a writing match with Henry Steele Commager about what he was doing with the Confederacy. And he finally, after a couple of revisions that Commager rejected, essentially sent him a final, what Frank thought was a final manuscript and a tube of Vaseline, and said what he could do with it.
Okay.
Like I say, I grew up in a locker room. And anyway, Frank did not, and the contract then went to Steve Oates, who was of some renown for a very good biography of John Brown.
Right.
And for some reason, Steve didn't do it. I think Bell Wiley had a piece of it at one time, and it was up in the air. And I just, out of the blue, wrote to, I think it was Commager, and asked him about doing that book. And I said, I'm Frank Vandiver's student, but I'm not Frank Vandiver. And I sent him a copy of Confederacy's a Revolutionary Experience, and then went to some meeting, maybe the Southern Historical Society Association, and met with William Morris, who said, we'd like to try to convince you to do the Confederacy volume in this New American Nation series. I said, convince me?
Right.
It's destiny. And so I did it. I spent a lot of time revising it which is in effect retyping it for Commager, who I think really wanted to write the book himself, but just didn't want to commit the time. Anyway, he had an idea of how it should be, and I had to outlast him, and finally did, and got Morris into it after an exchange of copy with Commager, who was difficult to find. He was often in Bellagio in Italy with a wonderful grant. Yeah, of course. And there I was, toiling away in Athens, Georgia. Anyway, I finally got it in print and dedicated it to Frank, which I thought was some irony there.
Yeah, yeah.
Anyway, it got a front page review written by C. Van Woodward.
Oh, wow.
Funny name. And who was, if you wanted to know anything about Southern history, you asked Van.
Right.
And he was the media target at the time, and should have been, and was a great man. I met him finally on the Cape when I visited Bill McFeely there, and we had a picnic on the beach with Van and his friend, who was the grandmother of Superman. Was it Stephen Reeves?
Okay.
Somebody Reeves.
Yeah.
Who played Superman. Anyway, she was his grandmother.
Okay.
But I mean, she had other claims to fame. But she and Van were an item, and he was a wonderful man. He was very shy, and he didn't speak well in public, and he wasn't that garrulous in private either. But the man was a genius.
Yeah, for sure.
I walked out of one of his presentations at, I guess it was a Southern, but he was reviewing William J. Cash's Mind of the South, sort of raking it over again, saying that Cash was a first-rate, third-rater as an historian, and wasn't. It was a journalist.
Yeah.
And he could write a book entitled The Mind of the South with only a passing reference to John C. Calhoun, for example. And there wasn't anything about mind in it. Anyway, I walked out of that sucker until I then read it later when it was published. And I said, good Lord, this is genius. And I had walked out of the thing bored to tears.
Oh, yeah.
And because his speaking voice was not all that exciting.
Okay.
But anyway, Van was a tower, and I feel like one of his students, even though I wasn't one of his students. But it all began in that carol at the Baldwin Library, reading The Burden of Southern History.
Yeah.
And, following his insight from then on.
And he reviewed your. Were you nervous when you saw that he was going to review the book?
Well, the interesting thing is, the cover of the magazine had the scene from Gone with the Wind with all the wounded lying in the railroad yard.
Okay.
That was the cover, and but anyway, Van wrote a very insightful review, saying that it was good, and it was to the degree that it didn't answer the questions it posed them.
Yeah.
That it inspired people to think more about the Confederacy, which that was part of why I wrote the thing in the first place.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's probably, I don't know, Ed Larson, who's a friend of mine and a former colleague, said, well, your masterpiece is Confederate Nation. And when they were selecting book jackets to put on the display cases at the University of Georgia, that's the one they selected for me.
Yeah.
Since after that, I wrote another think book, essentially a textbook called The American War and Peace. I did that before I wrote the Confederate Nation.
Right.
That was for Prentice Hall. And The American War and Peace, I think, is it's a better book than its reviews.
Okay.
I still think it's fun, even though there's some awful gaffes in it. There's a map of Chattanooga, Tennessee, with the Tennessee River on the wrong side of Chattanooga.
Yeah.
Other than that, it's a genius. But anyway, The American War and Peace I thought, it's about the Civil War and Reconstruction. And I really learned about Reconstruction from having to write that book. And I discovered that I thought Reconstruction was a tragic era, but it was a tragic era not for all the reasons that Southerners had thought it was, but it was a tragic era because the United States, as the victor, could impose its will and should have and could have resolved the issue of race in American history by taking up some responsibility for the 4 million freedmen and giving them something other than promises and offering civil rights to people whom then they turned over to the pleasant company of their former masters.
Right.
And really, the United States did not reconstruct the South. They simply just resurrected the old South.
Yeah.
In a different set of clothing, just as Woodward said.
Well, let me ask you, like, how do you sort of put yourself in the historiography? Because I mean, The Confederate Nation was one of the first books I read when I was a PhD candidate working on my dissertation. And then later you get people like Gallagher. Like, did you feel like you were doing something? I mean, I think you probably knew you were doing something different than past scholars, even someone like Vandiver. Like, where do you kind of place yourself? Was there kind of a new, a different school of historiography happening in the 70s with the Confederacy that you were part of?
I'd like to believe that.
Yeah.
However, I think in Charleston, Mother Emanuel Church, 9 people killed, and the perpetrator is best known probably for the photograph of him in front of a car that had a representation of an erroneous one, I point out, of the battle flag of the Army of Northern Virginia, the crossed banners and the stars and bars. And anyway, it was the battle flag, not the official flag.
Okay.
But that made the Confederacy the boogeyman in American experience. And that's been the case ever since. The Confederate statues are going and gone, and we're renaming schools and roads and all kinds of things. Lee is he's been removed from prominence in New Orleans, and he's the subject of graffiti in his statue on Monument Avenue in Richmond. Jackson's gone. Stuart is gone. I could offer places for these people on my farm, but that's probably not going to happen. Anyway, I did an essay that fortunately I didn't publish anywhere, entitled "Make the Confederacy Great Again," in which I really think the Confederacy gets short shrift and has made the boogeyman in the American experience. The Confederacy was more than a fight for slavery. It had to do with a fight for home and family and neighbors and defense against an invading enemy.
And you've said about, in reference to your biography about Jeb Stuart, Bold Dragoon, that you identified with Jeb Stuart. How was that exactly?
Well, Leader Stuart, I play a game with Civil War classes near the beginning of each semester or quarter, in which I ask them, with what character in this period do you most identify? And I laundry list these on the blackboard. There are a lot of Stonewall Jacksons, and there's some Robert E. Lees, and there's some Frederick Douglasses, and every now and then, and maybe a Mary Chestnut. Not always many women.
Right.
But anyway, I make something of this, and at the end of me trying to say, well, this really says more about you than it does about the American Civil War. And that's important, that we understand that history is about us, about people.
Right.
About the present and about the questions we ask and the identification we make with the past and how we do it and what memory is about. And I was anticipating all these memory studies, I think. But the students then turned it on me and said, okay, what figure do you most identify with? And I just off the top of my head said, cavalry, charge, Form 4s, draw sabers, Jeb Stuart. That sounds exciting enough. And I always thought of pulling a guard on a sweep play in football was not unlike a cavalry charge.
Okay.
You went and tried to gore the enemy.
Yeah.
So that your running back could pick his way down the field. So I said Jeb Stuart. And so at the time, my good friend Tom Connolly was committed to writing, and had a contract actually, to write a biography of Robert E. Lee. And so I wanted to do Lee, but I wasn't going to fool with Lee as long as Connolly was engaged. First, because he's a friend, and I didn't want to compete with him. And second, because he had already written The Marble Man, and so I knew he knew more about Lee than I had thought of. And I would be starting to write a biography with Connolly, furlongs ahead of me.
Okay.
So anyway, so I said, okay, I'll do Stuart. Because it wasn't a biography of Stuart that was really current. And so I had a good time with that and figured out that Stuart, I don't always consider myself a military historian, but I said Stuart has really revised the whole notion of what a cavalry is about. And it's about not thundering in after an infantry charge, as Napoleon conceived it, but it's really about controlling the space between armies. And so you understand what the enemy might be thinking about by the way he's moving his troops around, and you're denying the enemy knowledge of your army because you're controlling the middle ground. It's sort of like air superiority, in the modern sense. And anyway, I said that's what Stuart was about, but really revamping the whole notion of cavalry. And he was doing so and having a damn good time doing it. And as long as he had men and horses of consequence, did it rather well. He failed to do it, and even though he claimed otherwise, but he began to fail when the Union or cavalry gained the experience necessary and stopped having the school of the soldier trying to teach a bunch of, rural Wisconsins which end of the horse to ride and to get up on the left side. Once the Union cavalry became his equal and better supplied, then Stuart was, faded quickly, and then had the good grace to get mortally wounded. And I played around with masks and all kinds of things that I thought humans were into, and still are. And I learned some things. My son, the journalist, I wrote to him and said, would you read this a couple of chapters and see, I'm trying to get inside the man, get inside of his head. And son Emory wrote back and said, you can't get inside of the man. You can't know him that well. The best thing you can do is ride beside him and explain him that way. And
that's some good advice.
I learned from this.
Yeah.
And also, Bill McFeely was kind enough to read some of the draft of the Stuart biography too, and he offered some counsel. But it was mainly because I couldn't write a biography of Lee and couldn't think of anybody and I said, hey, why not? And then by that time, Connolly had really decided that he was not going to do Lee because he kept getting stuck on the image of Lee instead of saying what Lee was. He wanted to say what people thought about Lee.
Yeah.
And so I said, okay, I'm going to do this. And so I started from scratch, and I had Douglas Southall Freeman, 4 volumes, Pulitzer Prize, but written in the 1930s. And I said, there's some stuff about Lee that we want to know since then.
Right.
And we need a Lee that we want to know now. And that sort of influenced my biography. And I still, I stand by it. I probably would have, if I were to rewrite it, I'd be more emphasis on race. Although I do say that Lee was, in some ways, he believed in evolution and believed that white folks like himself were the product of evolution, and that black people were down on the pyramid somewhere above American Indians, whom Lee didn't like much, somewhere around Mexicans who he thought were captives of the Catholic Church, and they were in there. They were on the evolutionary scale, but beneath white folks. And anyway, that was Lee's attitude toward race, I thought, and I tried to say this and give examples.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned Freeman. I'm guessing I think in this interview I listened to of yours, you used to listen to his radio broadcast in the morning?
Yeah, I used to. Well, I thought everybody did. I mean,
yeah.
I'm really talking about middle-class white folks,
right,
in Richmond, Virginia, who listened to Dr. Freeman, who was on, I think, from 8 to 8:15 every morning, and you couldn't go to school until Dr. Freeman was through, because nobody's carpool or nobody could give you a ride to school until Dr. Freeman was over.
Yeah.
Because, well, everybody I knew was listening to Dr. Freeman. Now, I know that's not true, but I didn't know it at the time.
Yeah, it was a pretty big deal in Richmond. And I mean, how, obviously things have changed a lot in Richmond, but like, how palpable was the Civil War lost cause for you growing up? And were you reading about it as a kid? Was it just kind of out there? What impact
it was?
It
was out there. I mean, it was. My wife was fond of saying that that we were taught history in Richmond schools, and it was really about the Revolution and the Civil War, and everything after the Civil War was current events.
Right. Yeah.
You didn't worry about that. Anyway, that's Fran Thomas analysis, and she's right. You know, for me, Richmond, the Civil War was women in floppy hats and white hair and red faces telling sad stories.
Okay.
And I really didn't want any part of that.
Okay. So did you go to the battlefields, things like that?
I didn't go to the battlefields until after my graduate experience.
Okay.
And then only did I go to battlefields. And there's some that I haven't. I've been to a lot of battlefields. I'm trying to think of ones that I haven't been to.
Yeah.
But not with the encyclopedic.
Yeah. Right.
Attitude that, to some degree, Gary Gallagher takes. Gary is a good friend as well, and he's done some really, really good stuff.
But not not reverence necessarily when you're growing up. Like, you weren't taught to revere the Confederate leaders or anything.
Well, we were, yeah.
You were, okay.
Of course.
Well, there's sort of Freeman levels of reverence, and then there's, I don't know. I mean, for Freeman,
there's a story of a little girl in Richmond who comes home from Sunday school and looks at the portrait of Robert E. Lee hanging over the fireplace, which of course is appropriate in every Richmond home. And she looks at the 3 stars on his collar and says, Father, Son, and Holy Ghost.
Yeah, I mean, Freeman, obviously, he's, even among the Lost Cause school, he's kind of an extreme example, saluting the monument every day on his way to the news leader.
Right.
It's pretty crazy. But did you set out to do it all in one volume, or did you toy with the idea of maybe 2 volumes or whatever on Lee?
No, I really thought I was going to do a 1-volume Lee. That was
okay.
what I hoped for.
Okay.
And that I thought that Freeman in some ways was daunting with the 4 volumes.
Right.
And I wanted to be more accessible. And at the time, well, and still, I think 1-volume biographies are the way that the American reading public, with the exception, of course, of the new John F. Kennedy book and the proposed more volumes of that,
Yeah.
taking beyond the decision to run for president.
Yeah.
Anyway, I think that Americans really want to read one volume, and The Splendid and the Vile, Churchill,
Well,
other.
I think nowadays,
Hamilton.
I think nowadays it does still happen. You have multi-volume books on one subject, but I think I can just speak for myself and say thank you for putting it in one volume in a very accessible way, because Freeman, I've read Lee's Lieutenants. I've read one volume of that all the way through, but I have not read the entire Robert E. Lee 4 volumes. It's just so much, and probably more than I need to know, honestly. I use it as a reference a lot, but no, I think you did a lot of things very well. And even just kind of laying out the 7 days campaign, which we're kind of in the anniversary right now, you just sort of broke it down one day at a time. And for me, that was very helpful to understand those battles without laborious detail, as some people will give you, but just kind of breaking it down.
Yeah, I tried to understand. Well, I became convinced that Lee was convinced that he had to win the thing by destroying an enemy army, and he had to win a complete victory,
right?
That would be significant enough to turn the war around, because he knew that he was going to get. Well, he was going to reach his zenith of capacity, power, size of army, equipment, rations, and the like. And he reached that roughly in June of 63. I think the Confederate armies were as large as they were going to ever be again. So Lee tried to have a decisive battle at a little place called Gettysburg. His idea was, we're going to win this thing today, this afternoon.
Right.
Or at least we're going to break through here. This is going to be the beginning of something really significant.
Yeah.
He told Jefferson Davis that he was just going to go and have a nice time in the North and take the war to the enemy and that sort of thing. But what he was really after was a decisive victory that would turn the war around.
Right. Yeah, and did not get it, obviously, not Stuart's finest hour either, as a cavalryman. So that was your last. I know you did Robert E. Lee, an album, came out in 2000, but the Lee biography was your last book. Did you want to?
Well, actually, there's another.
Oh, I'm sorry.
There's another one, The Dogs of War, 1861.
Okay.
In which I argue that the Civil War didn't have to happen.
Okay.
That it mainly occurred because nobody thought it would, and thought that if it did happen, we were going to win in one decisive battle or campaign. It wasn't going to be anything consequential, and we were going to win it. We being either the Confederates or the United States. And I cite examples of all the Yankees are a bunch of ribbon clerks who are cowards from the beginning. And if they weren't cowards, they soon were taught to be. And so they're not going to fight. All Southerners are a bunch of lazy aristocrats sitting around drinking mint juleps on their verandas,
right.
Beating on their slaves as the only exercise they are willing to indulge in. That kind of, anyway, and I argue that Abraham Lincoln really never understood the American South, even though he should have. He married into it. He visited into it. He lived into it for a time growing up, but he never quite, he was convinced that the American Southerners wouldn't fight. And when they did fight, he said, well, they're not going to continue to fight.
Yeah.
And when they continued to fight, he was baffled and said, this is against their economic interests. How can they do this? they're fools. And I think anyway, he was convinced that there wouldn't be much war. And when there was much war, he thought, well, they're going to come to their senses. And in 1865, he was convinced that, well, now the southern mass of white folks, the southern plain folk, if you will recognize that their former politicians have led them astray and led them into folly, and they'll turn around and become good Republicans.
Right.
And there's a lot of the Whig Party left over in the South. There are 4 million potential black voters. The Republican Party is, and this is Kenneth Stamp, the Republican Party is going to have a wonderful culture in the American South. And that's what he thought Reconstruction was going to be. Of course, he was dead before anything really happened.
Well, my apologies about that book. I just looked it up. It looks like you got that published right in time for the sesquicentennial, 2011.
Yeah, and well, it turns out to be. It was supposed to be in a series that Jim McPherson edited, something like Crucial Points in American History, but it didn't turn out that way. It became something else, primarily because I just didn't want to go through the whole secession crisis, and I thought that there were other works that had the individual, the Compromise of 1850 and all the rest. Anyway, I just wanted to think larger, and I finally decided that the war happened because of a failure of communication.
Yeah, I'll say.
to
There were a number of books that came out right around that time that were sort of similar in terms of the war. I mean, like Bill Cooper had a book, Nelson Langford had a book.
Yeah.
What did you kind of make of the sesquicentennial? Were you involved with that? Or
Yeah. The Citadel in Charleston put on a wonderful. They had a society of Fort Sumter and Moultrie that raised a lot of money. Robert Rosen was important in this. Rosen, who's written a book about the Jewish Confederates. We had the beginning of the war. We had a whole lecture series in Charleston, actually in a theater.
Okay.
I think that was when we had the theater, but it was a big deal. Jim McPherson and Ed Ayers and other luminaries, and I was fortunate in being part of that. And then in the sesquicentennial of the end of the war, we had another gathering and series of lectures. Quick, who wrote Race and the American... Oh, damn.
You're not thinking of David Blight, are you?
Yeah, I am thinking of David Blight.
Okay.
Anyway, he discovered, really, the first American memorial, which took place in Hampton Park, which is near the Citadel, and is a sort of a new urban gentrification attempt. It was a prison camp, or was a race course for planter elites, and then it was a prison camp for Yankee prisoners, many of whom died and were buried in a mass grave, or a series of mass graves. The African Americans, the black folk in the neighborhood, dug all these people up and gave them they identified them if that were possible, and gave them individual graves, and then in effect had the Americans' first Memorial Day by having a big parade and bands, and Blight says 2,000 children marching to celebrate the accomplishment of these people honoring those soldiers who had tried to fight to free them.
Yeah.
anyway, we had that experience. The end of it was at Hampton Park. David gave a outdoors citadel band or chorus, really, and David gave this explanation of why we were there and why it was important that this was a Memorial Day and this was significant in American memory, because you couldn't find anything about this event, about this reburial and about the celebration by reading the newspapers, because they were all published by white folks.
Okay.
And had no intention of honoring this, which became America's first Memorial Day. Anyway, this featured speaker was Coatsworth Pinckney, who was the chief pastor of Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston. And he gave an 11-minute, essentially, homily, taking his text about Absalom, King David, and his son Absalom in another civil war in which Absalom was killed by David's subordinates, even though they were told not to. And David went to the body and grieved and wept that his son had died, even though his son was opposing him in the war. And he said that, Pinckney said, this is not unlike that experience, that here we have a civil war and we have people who are buried and we honor their memory, and we look to living beyond the Absalom moment in which there's killing and grief, and we have to live out of that. And 3 weeks later, he was dead.
Oh, wow.
Killed at Mother Emanuel. And I argue in something that I didn't publish that his greatest achievement, Pinckney's, was not necessarily his ministry, but he obviously imposed or influenced his parishioners to understand about loving your enemy. Because when the criminal, whose name I can't really think of right now,
Dylan Roof.
Yes.
Yeah.
Dylan Roof, when he was arraigned, members of Mother Emanuel and relatives of people who were killed or wounded showed up and in public forgave him and said they would pray for him.
Wow.
I think that, to me, was Pinckney's an instance of his influence on his congregation and the expression of his faith and his capacity to inspire his parishioners. And that was, to me, his greatest achievement.
Yeah, that sounds like a powerful moment, and I was I was just there in Charleston and walked by the church, and I said, flowers out front, and it was right around the anniversary. I think it might have been a day or two before I was there, but I had not been there before. I wanted to check it out, but yeah, I mean, obviously these things are alive and well, and we're still dealing with the legacy of the Civil War. Where do you kind of see, maybe it's kind of like a last question because I've had you a long time here.
Yeah, we need to.
Sure. Maybe just sort of say where do you.
I watched Pinckney's funeral, which lasted for 4 hours, and we've been talking for 4 hours.
Yeah, so I don't know if you're going to review Alan Gelzo's book or not, because he's got a biography leak coming out, but where do you sort of see maybe some room for aspiring Civil War scholars, maybe grad students, young scholars? What do you think still needs to be done on the Civil War that hasn't been done?
The Black experience in the war needs, and this has been true forever.
Yeah.
The Black experience in Reconstruction needs. John Hope Franklin said this, 40 years ago when I asked him about the same question, what do we need to study? And he said, the Black experience. And because for a time, these people were in charge. They were the only ones who could vote. And you have people like Tunis Campbell, about whom one of my students wrote a biography, in coastal Georgia. And he and his militia controlled McIntosh County for, I don't know, 10 or 12 years. And he is justice of the peace, dispensed justice in favor of Black folks instead of white folks. And he was finally jailed and put on a chain gang and probably released on the understanding that he would move north, and he moved to Boston.
Okay.
But showed up later and was able to influence an election in McIntosh County that was of some consequence and indicated that he still had an incredible clout in the county. Anyway, Russ Duncan did a master's thesis that got published.
Oh, wow.
On Tunis Campbell by the University of Georgia Press.
Okay. And did he put together the Robert Gould Shaw letters?
Yes, he did.
Okay.
He did.
Okay. Yeah, I know.
Blue-eyed Child of Fortune.
Right.
Yeah, he got enthused about Shaw and did those and edited that book.
Okay.
But Russ Duncan is a very, very bright guy. He said he decided to come to Georgia and study with me after reading Confederate Nation on a nude beach in Greece. I don't know if I believe that story, but I'd like to.
Doesn't everybody do that when they read Confederate history?
On a nude beach, of course.
He's still there, isn't he? Isn't he in Europe still?
I think he's in Copenhagen.
Okay, yeah. No, I think you're right. I think the African-American story still needs to be told. There's some great books, and you still see them, but yeah, I think we need to go deeper, definitely into what's going on in the Confederacy during the war, I think.
Well, I think the Confederacy is a huge opportunity.
Yeah. Well, Emory, we've been talking a while, so I'll let you go and get some lunch, but just want to say thank you so much. And if you have the chance to come see us in Stratford soon, please do that. And
I shall.
Yeah, we'll roll out the red carpet for you.
No, I shall. And thank you for this, and thank you for giving a nod to the Confederacy and
sure.
The consequence, and that it was more than simply a bunch of rednecks. I mean, it was that.
Yeah.
It was that too. Damn it.
Right. No, I know, and obviously it's still being worked out. So there's a lot of ground for historians to cover still.
Exactly.
But I've been reading you a long time, so I was glad we could do this. It was a real honor to talk to you. So thank you very much.
Well, I loved it. Thanks very much.
All right, that was my talk with Emory Thomas. I hope you enjoyed that. If you didn't listen to part 1, please check that out. But I was really thankful for Emory making the time to talk about his work and his career, and I am hoping we will see him at Stratford Hall again soon. This is American Rambler. I'm your host, Colin Woodward. You can support this podcast by buying my book. I think that's the best way to support it, at least from a morale point of view. I only get about 80 cents per new copy as royalty, but hey, it all helps. My book is Marching Masters, Slavery, Race, and the Confederate Army During the Civil War, available through University of Virginia Press. New copies on Amazon, where you can also get Emory Thomas's books, which I think are all in print. But go on over to Amazon, or if you want a signed copy, you can contact me. And it is actually cheaper than getting the Amazon copy. I know it takes a little bit more work. You got to contact me, and you got to wait for me to ship it to you. But I can send you a new signed copy if you want. And professors that are thinking about books for the spring already, or at least that should be coming up in the next couple months, if you're teaching the Civil War or race relations or slavery, please think about my book. And even if it's 8 or 10 students, I'd really love it if you would assign it for a survey class. But in any case, if you did assign it for one of your classes, and you can be generous too. It can be Southern Studies, it can be literature, it can be political science. I don't know. I think it can fit in one of those categories. So please consider assigning my book. And if you do, and it's a big class, I'll be more than happy to talk to them on Zoom. If you're in Richmond, I might even come in person. Let's see, what's on the agenda for this weekend? Gonna be a nice one. Weather cooling down, but still looking for some pool time. I'll be watching the Red Sox. I've probably been watching too much. I mean, just about every game I've been watching. I guess making up for last year, but it's just really the best way for me to relax, because I'm kind of picky about TV shows and movies and stuff, but always opt for watching the game, especially with the fast forward feature on the MLB app. All right, I'll be talking with you soon. Take care. Stay safe. Bye.